You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter at RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans! Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am the Jacob Valk. And at the end of this show, you're going to get the interview that I did with Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. It was very interesting to hear some of these stories, let me tell you. Most of the guys that we talked about, not known to the average baseball fan. I found it very interesting, and I think you will too. But I have to start by previewing the Stanley Cup Playoffs, the best playoffs in sports. It's the middle of May, but we're finally getting playoff hockey. The NHL arranged this a little differently than I would have, but hey, we're here. The best playoffs in sports. It's not even close. I'll start by previewing the two East Division matchups. Meaning that I get to start with Penguins Islanders. You like how I did that? Look, I said that out of the three other East Division playoff teams, the Penguins, the Bruins, and the Capitals, I'd want to face the Penguins. I think the Islanders would get creamed by the Bruins. They are much more talented. And I don't want to go up against Tom Wilson because I think Wilson could kill Matthew Barzal. The Penguins were my preferred opponent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I think the Islanders are going to beat him. I'm really not impressed with this Islanders team. I don't think they're bad. They're not a bad team by any stretch. But they're not great. They're not world beaters. They had the chance to finish with a better record. They ended up losing 4 out of their last 5. The one game they won was the last regular season game at the Coliseum. So obviously they were a little more amped up for that game. I mean, there are two things that are going to play in their favor. Governor Cuomo did increase the capacity that the Nassau Coliseum can have. It used to be only 10% of capacity was allowed in. Now it's 25%. That's 2.5 times what it was previously. The Coliseum rocks for playoff games. I mean, it's going to sound very cliche, but home ice advantage for the Islanders would have been a really, really important thing. Obviously, they don't have home ice advantage, but look, games 3, 4, and 6 are at the Coliseum. That's something. You're going to be able to feel that energy. I'm going to go to all 3 games. I'm thinking of wearing earplugs. Those 3 games that the Islanders are playing at the Coliseum, they have a great chance of winning those games. And once you get to a game 7, anything can happen. The second thing that plays in the Islanders' favor, Semyon Varlamov. Varlamov just may be the hottest goalie in the NHL. Not that long ago, he pitched 248 minutes of shutout hockey. He is a money goalie. We saw that in the bubble. The old saying is true. All you need is a hot goalie in the NHL, and you can go on a big playoff run. The Islanders do have a hot goalie. For the Islanders to win this series, they need Varlamov to steal them games. It's just that simple. As for the Penguins, they've gotten healthy at the right time. Evgeny Malkin is back. Tristan Jarry's gonna play. The Penguins are functioning at 100%, which I can't say about the Islanders. Now, I'm going to be very interested to see how Malkin does in these playoffs. Since my birthday on March 18th, he's only played in 4 games. Now, granted, in those 4 games, he had 4 assists. But it is going to be interesting to see how Malkin responds to playing in the playoffs after missing so much time. I'm also going to be interested in the Penguins' power play. It's a power play that was really bad last year. It's been vastly improved. I give them full credit. But the Islanders do have a good penalty kill. The Penguins finished 4th in the NHL in power play percentage. They converted 23.7% of their power plays. The Islanders finished 6th in the NHL in penalty kill percentage. They killed off 83.7% of their penalties. That's the most intriguing matchup to me. I'm also going to be really interested in Tristan Jarry. His first playoffs as the undisputed starting goalie. You got to remember, last year the Penguins had Matt Murray. The Penguins are going to ride with Tristan Jarry here. Yes, they have Casey DeSmith, but Jarry's going to get first crack at it. Now, Jarry did start a game in the bubble last year. He started Game 4 against the Habs in the qualifying round. He only gave up 1 goal. It was a late third-period goal to Arturi Lehkonen. He didn't deserve the loss, but unfortunately for him, the Penguins couldn't solve Carey Price. Look, in the goalie matchup, which is usually the most important thing in the Stanley Cup Playoffs, the Islanders have the edge. It's just that simple. That bodes well for them. But I just can't confidently pick the Islanders in this series. The Anders Lee injury changed this team incredibly. Palmieri and Zajac have not worked. Look, if Tristan Jarry crumbles under the bright lights, which is possible, you can be a great regular season goalie all you want, but if you can't get it done in the playoffs, what good are you? We have no idea how Jarry's going to do. He's never been in this spot before. He started 1 game, that's it. If he folds, the Islanders are going to win this series. But I don't see it happening. I think the playoff veterans that the Penguins have will pick him up. Let's go Penguins in 6. Moving on now to Capitals Bruins. If the Capitals are going to win this series, it's going to be because of Peter Laviolette. The Capitals are going into these playoffs not at 100%. TJ Oshie's hurt. John Carlson is hurt. Evgeny Kuznetsov is still in the COVID protocol. Hell, even Ovechkin and Backstrom missed some time last week. How do you compensate for that? Next man up. See, hockey isn't that sport where if your team sustains a bunch of injuries, you change everything. Instead of playing a trap, you play aggressive. Instead of trying to win 5-4 games, you win 1-0 games. No, it doesn't work like that. It's a strict, regimented game. It's not like football where if your quarterback is out, you just run the ball a lot. Or if your left tackle is out, you run the ball to the right side a lot. It's a next man up sport. And what that means is that the system needs to be on point. The whole needs to be greater than the sum of its parts. That's where Laviolette comes in. One of the best coaches in the NHL. Someone who I have the utmost respect for. We all know the talent that the Capitals have. As infuriating as they are because of Tom Wilson, they have fantastic players. Ovechkin, Backstrom, Justin Schultz, Anthony Mantha has come in and has fit in perfectly with that team. That trade has worked out a lot better than I thought it would. What scares me about the Capitals is their goalie situation. They're going to start Vitek Vanacek. This is his rookie season. Has Vanacek been good? Yes. He's 21-10-4 with a .269 goals against and a .908 save percentage. But it does scare me when you're going into a playoff series with an unproven goalie. And when that guy is going up against a team like the Boston Bruins, a team with probably the best forward core in the NHL, that's tough. That's how the Bruins are going to win this series. Just put pucks on net. Use your skill to overwhelm the Capitals. The Bruins' defense has been shaky all year. Outside of Charlie McAvoy, do they have anyone that scares you? Matt Grzelcyk is solid. Mike Riley's solid. That's about it. I've heard that some people are concerned about Tuukka Rask and how he may do because of their bad defense. No. Rask will be fine. Yes, he dealt with injuries this year. Maybe he's not going to be the runner-up for the Vezina Trophy like he was last year. But he still went 15-5-2 with a .228 goals against and a .913 save percentage. Yeah, I'll take Rask on my team. Some people brought up the fact that he left the bubble, he couldn't deal with it. The bubble was hard. These players couldn't see their families. They couldn't leave. All they did was play hockey when they were in the bubble. That's it. You need time off from that. And from what I read, they were given steak for like every meal. Look, I like steak just as much as the next guy. I can't have it for every meal. Maybe Ron Swanson can, but I can't. Rask will be fine. I have no concerns about him. I think the Bruins are going to be an incredibly tough team to beat in these playoffs. I don't know if there's any team that can match up with them in terms of star power. I've got to go Bruins in 5. Moving on now to the North Division. I'll start with the best rivalry in all of hockey. Leafs, Canadiens. It doesn't get any better than this. When you can have an epic rivalry in the playoffs, viewership goes up, interest goes up. It's fantastic for the league. All of Canada is going to be tuned in to that series. All of the hockey world will be tuned into that series. Look, that rivalry may not be as ferocious as Yankees-Red Sox, or Packers-Bears, or Duke-UNC, or OSU-Michigan, but it is the best rivalry that the sport has. When you get that in the playoffs, magic happens. If the Leafs are going to win this series, it's going to be because of their offense. As much as I like Jack Campbell, can you trust him to win 1-0 games? Can you trust him to win 2-1 games? Campbell should be the starting goalie in these playoffs. We don't know if he's going to be. This series doesn't even start until Thursday. Think about that. The Leafs are actually playing a regular season game tonight in Winnipeg. It's a joke. Series could be basically over with by the time that Leafs-Habs starts. I'm previewing it now because I'm previewing all the other series. I don't want to be disjointed, but man, this is tough. Everyone's amped up for Leafs Canadiens in the playoffs. We have to wait a week for it. It makes no sense. But look, Jack Campbell should be the starter. I've said that before. As much as I like him, I don't think you want him needing to win 2-0 games. Let's say like 3-2 games. That's fair. That's a fair expectation for Campbell, and if he can't do that, shame on him. So I'm looking at guys like Mitch Marner, Austin Matthews, who scored 41 goals this year, led the NHL, absolutely insane. John Tavares, William Nylander, Morgan Riley, Jason Spezza, and Jake Muzzin to all step up and just dominate offensively. That's how the Leafs are going to win this series. As obvious as this is, if the Habs are going to win, I feel like they need Carey Price. Look, we saw Price in the bubble play some of the best hockey you could see. This guy is a money goalie. Maybe he's not the greatest regular season goalie. He's never going to win another Hart Trophy. He's never going to win another Vezina Trophy. But this guy is a money goalie. The Habs won a playoff series last year by having Carey Price steal them wins. Game 1 against the Penguins, Price faced 41 shots, stopped 39. Game 4, an elimination game, he pitched a shutout. Even going past that, Price never had a game against the Flyers where he gave up more than 3 goals. The Habs just couldn't solve Carter Hart. That's why they lost that series. I don't trust this Habs offense to go off. I like Tyler Toffoli. He can't do it all by himself. Nick Suzuki? Okay. Tomas Tatar? Fine. No one's going to be mistaking these guys for Bernie Geoffrion, Maurice Richard, and Guy Lafleur anytime soon. That plays in the Leafs' favor. I am expecting close games. I don't think you're going to get a lot of offensive explosions. But I do expect the Leafs to win 3-2 games. I think the Leafs are better. Price may steal a couple games, but I'll go Leafs in 6. Moving on now to Oilers-Jets. Kind of interesting how the North Division worked out. The first matchup is against 2 Eastern teams. And the second matchup is against 2 Western teams. I'm sure Justin Trudeau likes that. I know he wasn't crazy about having these teams crisscross his country. I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens once the winner of the North Division has to face an American team. Is that North Division team going to have to play their home games in the U.S.? I don't know. It's going to be interesting. If the Oilers are going to win this series, it's got to be because of 2 players. That's it. Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. Everyone else, I don't want to say is irrelevant. That's not true. But if McDavid and Draisaitl are at the top of the importance scale, everyone else, guys like Barry, Nurse, Nugent-Hopkins, Puljujarvi, Yamamoto, etc., are way, way, way below them. McDavid finished with 104 points this year. Remember, it was only a 56-game season. In fact, wait a minute, I take that back. He could actually get more because the Oilers are playing tomorrow against the Canucks. Gotta keep that in the back of my mind for these Canadian teams. My God. So annoying. So dumb. Draisaitl has 83 points. You take a look at the leaders in points in the NHL this year. McDavid, top of the league, 104 points. Second, Leon Draisaitl, 83 points. For whatever it's worth, third is Brad Marchand with 69 points. So Marchand is 14 points behind Draisaitl. McDavid and Draisaitl are in a league of their own. If you wanted to say that they were the 2 best players in the NHL, I'd have a tough time disagreeing with you. That's how dominant they are this year. Let me tell you, that doesn't bode well for how the Jets are going to need to win this series. Their offense really doesn't terrify me. They have solid players, Mark Scheifele, Kyle Connor, Nick Ehlers, and Blake Wheeler, but none of those guys are great. Connor Hellebuck is going to need to steal some games. How is he going to do that against McDavid and Draisaitl? I have no idea, but that's what's necessary. I'm also looking at their top defensive pairing of Josh Morrissey and Dylan DeMello to, if not shut down McDavid and Draisaitl, limit them. Do I see that happening? No. Is this a terrible matchup for the Jets? Yes. Is this going to be a romp? Yes. Oilers in 4. Let's go to the Central Division now. Hurricanes, Predators. Only in 2021 could this be a first-round playoff matchup. If you're ever going to see this matchup again, it's going to be in the Stanley Cup Finals. This is the only first-round matchup that features a traditional Eastern Conference team going up against a traditional Western Conference team. Now, granted, it's not New York to California, North Carolina to Tennessee isn't a terrible trip, but I do think that's noteworthy. If the Hurricanes are going to win, they're going to need to pick a goalie and stick with him. They really have 3 capable goalies: Peter Mrazek, Alex Nedeljkovic, and James Reimer. It seems like Mrazek is going to get the start in Game 1. Stick with him. Mrazek is a really good goalie. The last thing you want to do is swap goalies in and out. You have the guy who was going to be your unquestioned starter back at 100%. Mrazek has only played 12 games this year. Just stick with him. That and play through Sebastian Aho. He is by far and away their best player. Led them in goals and assists. The Islanders got the wrong Sebastian Aho. It's just that simple. If the Predators are going to win, they need to play Barry Trotz style hockey. All defense, no offense. They may be the worst offensive team in these playoffs. And that's saying something, because the Islanders are not a great offensive team. But at least the Islanders have Matthew Barzal. The Predators don't have anyone close to him. As great as Roman Josi is, and he's one of the best defensemen in the NHL, if you have a defenseman leading you in points, and his name isn't Bobby Orr, that's an issue. And even then, it's not like Josi put up a bunch of points. He had 33 points. The Predators didn't have anyone score 15 goals. They didn't have anyone put up 35 points. They're really not a scary team. UC Saros, if we're using the word valuable literally, is the most valuable player in the NHL. Without him, the Predators are cooked. Saros went 21-11-1 with a 2.28 goals against and a 9.27 save percentage. They're going to need Saros to do his best impression of Martin Brodeur if they want to win this series. They need to play sound defensive hockey, force bad shots, keep the Hurricanes to the outside. But at the end of the day, Barry Trotz isn't in Nashville anymore. I don't see that working out for him. I'll give the Predators a game because Saros has been that good this year. But I'm going to have a tough time getting into this series. Hurricanes in 5. Moving on now to Panthers Lightning. Incredibly enough, this is the first time that the two Florida teams will meet in the playoffs. I find that very, very interesting. If the Panthers are going to win this series, they need to play through Jonathan Huberdeau and Alexander Barkov. They are by far and away the two best Panthers. And Sergei Bobrovsky needs to step up and be the money goalie that the Panthers are paying him to be. Let me tell you, Chris Driedger had a better season than Bobrovsky. Bobrovsky went 19-8-2 with a .291 goals against and a .906 save percentage. No shutouts. Driedger went 14-6-3 with a .207 goals against, a .927 save percentage, and 3 shutouts. Bobrovsky's going to be on a short leash. It wouldn't surprise me at all if you saw Driedger start at least one game in this series. As for the Lightning, they just need to use their skill. On paper, they are the better team. And it seems like they're at 100%. I mean, I'll just rattle through these names really quickly. Braden Point, Andre Palat, Victor Hedman, Yanni Gourde, Steven Stamkos, Alex Killorn, Blake Coleman, and Mikhail Sergachev. Can you say star power? The Lightning's 4 best players are better than the best player on the Panthers, Jonathan Huberdeau. I'd also say that keeping Andrei Vasilevsky healthy is important, because Curtis McElhinney hasn't had a good season, neither has Chris Gibson, but that seems a little cliche. Vasilevsky does need to be the Vasilevsky of old, though. I will say that. Because if he crumbles, McElhinney or Gibson isn't going to come in and save the day. They just don't have that ability. I'll say this, I think that Joel Quenneville is going to have some answers to whatever John Cooper throws at him. This is probably the best coaching matchup of the first round. But I do think the Lightning are the much better team. The Panthers could steal a couple games because of Quenneville, but the Lightning will win. Lightning in 6. Moving on now to the West Division. I'll start with Avalanche Blues. The Avalanche are probably the most well-rounded team of the playoffs. They scored the 3rd most goals in the league, gave up the 5th least goals in the league. They had 5 players score over 40 points. Mikko Rantanen, Nate McKinnon, Gabriel Landeskog, Andrei Burakovsky, and Cale Makar. And when you get past them, the depth doesn't fall off a lot. Nazem Kadri, Sam Girard, Jonas Donskoy, Devon Taves. Philip Grubauer is playing like he's one of the best goalies in the NHL. He led the NHL in shutouts this year with 7. He had an under 2 goals against. The Avalanche are going to be a really tough out for any team. As for the Blues, they're a good team. They're a little top-heavy. Besides David Perron and Ryan O'Reilly, they really don't have anyone that scares me. I like Jordan Kyrou a lot. I think he's going to be a very good center in this league for a long time. But can you expect him to take over a playoff series in what's basically his first full season in the league? You can expect Jordan Binnington to. He did it in 2019. But realize, in the bubble, he was dreadful. Didn't win a single game. Had an .800 save percentage. He was anemic. I don't like how the Blues match up against the Avalanche. I'll be nice and give him a game. I don't even know why I'm doing that. Probably because my friend Eric is a Blues fan. Avalanche in 5. The last playoff series to preview is Golden Knights Wild. This is a really scary Golden Knights team. It is tough who's more well-rounded, the Avalanche or the Golden Knights. I'd probably go with the Avalanche, but if you wanted to say the Golden Knights, okay, fine. They have Mark Stone, Max Pacioretty, Jonathan Marchessault, and Shea Theodore. They have a money goalie in Marc-Andre Fleury. And if something happens to him, they have Robin Lehner. The dogfight between the Avalanche and the Golden Knights for the top seed in the West Division was a very fun battle to track. I will say this, though, don't count out the Wild. They're a fun team, they're an exciting team, they're a young team, but they also have some really good veterans. Do they have stars? The answer is no, but sometimes you don't need stars. If you just have a bunch of really good players pulling in the same direction, that's all you need sometimes. You've got guys like Kirill Kaprizov, Kevin Fiala, Matt Zuccarello, who I always liked, Jordan Greenway, Joel Eriksson-Ek, and Cam Talbot. The Wild are a good team. Unfortunately for them, they're just going up against this steamroller in the Golden Knights. Do I think the Wild will make the Golden Knights work? The answer is yes, but I do think the Golden Knights will win. Give me Vegas in 6. And I will say this. The last 2 second-round matchups that I put together, Leafs Oilers and Avalanche Golden Knights, that's must-see TV. Stay up late for those games. You won't be disappointed. I promise you. You're going to feel it the next day when you have to get up at 7 a.m. for work, but you're going to see excellent hockey. Alright, now I'll give you some NFL Valk talk. And I'll start with the Chiefs making a very interesting trade. It's not a blockbuster, but this is an interesting gamble. The Chiefs traded their 6th rounder next year to the Vikings in exchange for Mike Hughes and their 7th rounder next year. Look, Mike Hughes has potential. He has some talent. He has a first-round pedigree. He was taken 30th overall by the Vikings out of UCF. I did like him in that draft. I did think he could be something really good. Unfortunately for him, he got bit by the injury bug. In his rookie year, he only played 6 games. Last year, he only played 4 games. This is a potential bet. Hughes is 24 years old. There could still be something there. Have we seen it yet? No. Last year, according to Pro Football Focus, he had just a 54.4 overall grade. But this is a worthwhile gamble for the Chiefs. You get the last year of his rookie contract, because the Vikings did decline his 5th-year option, unsurprisingly. If he turns into something, great. You needed cornerback depth anyway. If not, it's a worthwhile gamble. No one's going to begrudge you for it. Quite frankly, I wouldn't have minded the Jets doing this. Lord knows they need corners. Take a chance on someone who's young and has a first-round pedigree. This trade makes a ton of sense for the Chiefs. They do win it. I know why the Vikings did it. They just wanted to get rid of him. Get something for him. If you didn't think that he was going to be a major part of your future. So while I don't begrudge the Vikings for doing what they did, I like this trade for the Chiefs more. Moving on now to the Broncos, signing Cameron Fleming to a 1-year deal worth up to $3.67 million. And this is an interesting move for the Broncos. They just signed Bobby Massey. You thought he was going to be gifted the starting right tackle job? He may have to earn it. We may be looking at a preseason battle between Massey and Fleming. I'll say this, Fleming is nowhere near as good as Massey. He's a good backup, and the Broncos needed a backup right tackle anyway. So look, I really like this move. Fleming was brought in by the Giants last year because he was familiar with Joe Judge and Jason Garrett. He did not play well last year, had just a 58.4 overall grade. That's fine for a backup, but when you're starting every game, that's not going to work. But look, in under a week, George Payton turned a weakness into a strength. About a week ago, their starting right tackle was probably some schmagegi named Quinn Bailey, who no one in Denver would know if he came to their house and delivered them a pizza. The same thing holds for their presumptive backup, Drew Himmelman. Now you've got Bobby Massey as the starter, a proven starter, and you've got Cameron Fleming as your backup, a proven backup. Great job by the Broncos, great job by George Payton. This move makes a ton of sense. Alright, here's my interview with Bill Deane.
You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be joined by Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. Bill, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, you wrote about 40 really interesting players in the annals of baseball history. We're not going to go through all 40. If I asked you to do that, we'd be here until Thanksgiving. I like to spend Thanksgiving with my family. You're a nice guy, but I'm not going to keep you that long. What I have done is I have singled out the 21 most interesting guys in the book. We're going to go through short synopses of their careers. We'll keep it short and sweet. We'll hit on the main points. It's going to be really fun. And we'll start with Ross Barnes. We'll go in alphabetical order. What can you tell us about him?
Ross Barnes was the best non-pitcher of baseball, pro baseball's first decade or so. He starred in the National Association, which was a predecessor to the major leagues that operated from 1871 to 75, and then was a star in the first year of the National League as well in 1876. But then he suddenly lost his effectiveness in 77. Historians have said it was because of a rule change that year, but my research indicates that it was due to some typhoid-like illness which just sapped his strength and made him unable to compete at the high level that he established.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know what? You're 100% right that Barnes was one of the best players of the National Association and the early portion of the National League. 3-time batting title winner. I mean, he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. You're 100% right there. Really, really sad story. And here's another really sad story. Lyman Bostock. Can you lay that out for me?
Lyman Bostock played 4 years in the majors in the 1970s. He was one of the better hitters in baseball. He was kind of overshadowed by Rod Carew because he played in the same team and same league as Rod did for 3 of those years. But he had a .311 lifetime batting average, which ranked him 4th in the majors at the time. And then he was shot and killed by a crazed man who was trying to kill his ex-wife. And Bostock died at the age of 27 in 1978. So his career was mostly what could have been rather than what was.
Yeah, really, really sad story. Right up there with guys like Nick Aidenhart and Tyler Skaggs. The guy was on his way to stardom, got some MVP votes in his last 2 seasons. Yeah, really, really interesting to speculate on what he could have done. Him and Carew would have been really good for a long time. So, how would you describe the career of Steve Busby?
Steve Busby was one of many pitchers, particularly in the 1970s, who had a lot of talent, and then their arms just blew out. And this was before rotator cuff surgery and Tommy John surgery were a commonplace, and pitchers were kind of conditioned to pitch through pain, and if they weren't willing to go 9 innings, they'd find somebody else that would, and that sort of thing. Busby, for a 2-year period from mid-1973 to mid-1975, won 45 games for a sub-500 team, and he was a young pitcher. He had 2 no-hitters already. He was really just warming up to what could have been a great career when his arm went south on him. He hung on for a few more years, but was no longer effective and was not able to in postseason at all when the Royals started winning. And it was just kind of a tragic story that he, just as he was reaching his peak and just as player salaries were going crazy and just as the team was becoming competitive, he was no longer able to contribute.
Yeah, I was just about to say, from 76 to 78, the Royals lost to the Yankees in 3 straight postseason series. If Busby had been healthy and had been his self, I don't know if the Yankees win all those series. I mean, it's really a very, very crazy what if.
Yeah, that's his biggest regret, was not being able to pitch at all in those postseasons, and he feels he could have made a difference. And
I'm sure he could have.
Yeah.
Talking to Bill Deane, the author of baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. So what can you tell us about Cesar Cedeno, a man whose autograph is actually right behind me right now?
Cesar Cedeno is kind of a classic story of somebody who was on a Hall of Fame path and just came off of it. And he came up at age 19 in 1970. By 1972 and 73, he was one of the very best players in baseball. And after the 73 season, the general managers during the winter meetings held an informal poll among themselves as to which player they would like to have if they could have any one player in the majors, and every one of them chose Cedeno. And little did they know that almost at that very moment something was happening that pretty much changed Cedeno's life and his career thereafter. He was in a hotel room with a woman in the Dominican Republic, not his wife. There was a gun. The gun went off. The woman was killed. There's different theories as to exactly what happened. Cedeno said it was accidental. The evidence seems to point that that's the truth. He was put in jail in the Dominican Republic, wound up kind of being settled out of court for $100. He was fined and charged with the equivalent of manslaughter, and then he went back to playing baseball, but he never could seem to maintain the same focus. He would have spurts of his old greatness, but he couldn't sustain them. He would get some heckling from fans that would bring that up and bring that back to the forefront. And he was still a productive player. He was a Gold Glove outfielder. He was stealing bases, but he just was not the same offensively, especially because he should have been improving at the age mid-20s and late 20s. He should have been reaching his peak, but instead he was trending downward.
Yeah, the one thing that you remember about Cedeno is that he was a really good fielder, won 5 Gold Gloves, and also was a speedster, finished his career with 550 steals. You're 100% right that he should have been remembered for a lot more, should have hit for a higher average, should have hit for more power. Yeah, that's one of those really, really tragic stories. And this story is by far and away the most tragic one in the book. Can you lay out the story of Ray Chapman?
As most baseball fans know, Ray Chapman is the only man who was killed on the field, only major leaguer who was killed on the field during a baseball game. In 1920, he was hit in the head by a pitch from Carl Mays, and he never regained consciousness and died the next day. As you say, it's a tragic story. A lot of people have said, if not for that Carl Mays would have made it to the Hall of Fame. Mays was a very good pitcher and has some very good credentials, but he was a very disliked player even before that, and that kind of cemented his reputation as a headhunter and just not a good person. But nobody or very few people have ever made the point that this incident is what has kept Ray Chapman from the Hall of Fame. He was an excellent shortstop during the dead ball era. He was a good offensive player, and he was just starting to come into his own, and he was just coming into the era when batting averages jumped by 40 points due to various reasons. There's no reason to expect that Chapman couldn't have played another 10 years as a 300-plus hitting shortstop and racked up numbers that would have earned him Hall of Fame enshrinement.
Now, there are some people who have gone back into the record and have said, like you said, Mays was a headhunter. They've said that was actually on purpose, Mays throwing at Chapman. Maybe he didn't expect to kill him, but that was on purpose. At least that's what some people say. I don't believe that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you say, I don't believe he deliberately was trying to kill Chapman, but I think he was trying to establish the inside of the plate. Chapman was somebody who kind of crouched over the plate, and I think Mays was trying to move him back. And this was a day when it was a gray day. It was a time when baseballs were hardly ever replaced during a game, so the ball was probably kind of graying, and they didn't have helmets in those days, so if you get hit in the right spot, it can kill you, and that's what happened.
All right, so how would you describe the career of Jack Coombs?
Jack Coombs was a very good pitcher in circa 1910. He came straight from college to the major leagues, pitching for Connie Mack's Athletics, and on a team that included a couple of other Hall of Fame pitchers. Coombs emerged as the ace of the team. 1910, he had one of the best seasons in American League history for a pitcher. He won 31 games, including 13 shutouts, had a 1.30 earned run average, and then went on to win 3 more games in the World Series that year. And he had a few more big years after that. He won 28 the following year and then 21. And then all of a sudden he was sidelined for a couple of years. A lot of different explanations given, but it seems that he had what was called typhoid of the spine, and he didn't win a single game. In 1913 or 14, he returned finally in 1915 and was still effective, but he was pitching on guile and brains. He no longer had the fastball and wasn't able to have a long career pitching that way. So he wound up with credentials that have been compared to Dizzy Deane's. He won 158 games in the majors, and including the big years like Deane had, but never got traction as a Hall of Fame candidate.
Hey, let me tell you, Jack Coombs was the best pitcher on 2 World Series winning teams. I mean, that's a feather in his cap that very few people have. Yeah, I'm with you that this guy was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. It's a tragedy that he's been lost to history. Talking to Bill Deane, the author of baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. So what can you tell us about Larry Corcoran?
In the early 1880s, Larry Corcoran was as good a pitcher as there was in Major League Baseball. For the first 5 seasons of the 1880s, he won more games, had more strikeouts than any other pitcher, and the ones closest to him both were Hall of Famers, John Clarkson and Old Hoss Radbourne. Corcoran pitched 3 no-hit games. Nobody broke that record until Sandy Koufax 80 years later. And he won 170 games in 5 seasons, 34 wins per year. And predictably, his arm went south on him the following year. His team basically didn't pay him while he was injured. He wound up coming back with another team, but he never was able to regain his form, and he didn't even pitch the requisite 10 years to be eligible for the Hall of Fame. 177 wins and 90 losses in his career, which is a pretty outstanding winning percentage.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a .665 winning percentage. I mean, Larry Corcoran was probably the second superstar pitcher in baseball history, the first probably being Al Spalding. Yeah, there's no question that this guy was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. It's really a very, very tragic story. I mean, I know I keep saying that, but it's true. All these stories are tragic. There's a human element that's lost to some people when evaluating these careers, and they shouldn't be. I mean, the human element is real. Fate is real. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
I agree, and I don't want to make it sound like the book is a series of just tragic stories. There are stories of redemption and players who were able to overcome what happened to them and become successful in other ways. Either we'll get to some of the others coming up, but either playing other positions or becoming well-known broadcasters and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, you could say that about Cedeno. Cedeno had a very long career. Yes, you're right, not a Hall of Famer by any stretch of the imagination, but he played 17 years in the majors. That's a career that anyone would sign up for. I'm sure you'd agree with that, right?
Very good player. He was, I think, the most similar players to him statistically are guys like Amos Otis and Felipe Alou and Gary Matthews. Good players, but not Hall of Fame caliber, whereas in the early part of his career, the most similar were guys like Willie Mays and Roberto Clemente. So
right.
Certainly went in a different direction than he was trending.
No question about that. So can you lay out the career of Charlie Ferguson?
Charlie Ferguson pitched only 4 years in the majors, the last at age 24, yet he won 99 games, an average of 25 per season. He was also an outstanding hitter and defensive player and was often used at other positions when he wasn't pitching. He was rated as an excellent second baseman. 1 year he played, I think it was 72 games and had 85 runs batted in and high 300s batting average. So he was a great all-around player, and he also contracted typhoid fever at a time that it was very commonplace. This is in the 1880s, 90s, and he died just after his 25th birthday before he could play another game in the major leagues.
Yeah, I mean, look, Charlie Ferguson was, without question, one of the first great pitchers of the National League. Every year that he pitched, he had at least 21 wins. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. I know that he started a bunch of games, but still, at least 21 wins. That's impressive. Yeah, he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. You're 100% right. Now, when you think of flying and baseball, you think of Thurman Munson, maybe you think of Corey Lytle, but you probably don't think about Ken Hubbs. How would you describe the absolutely tragic ending to his career?
Ken Hubbs was a second baseman in the 1960s. He came up at age 20, was Rookie of the Year. Just an all-around good guy, very religious, very people-oriented, family-oriented, and very, very popular player. Won a Gold Glove as a rookie, the only man other than Bill Mazeroski to win the Gold Glove in an 8-year period in the National League at second base. And he was holding his own offensively for a guy that young and at a position that didn't typically have good hitters. He was, according to Ron Santo, he was a Ryne Sandberg. He would have been a Ryne Sandberg type of player if he was able to blossom, and, as most people do in their 20s and 30s. He took up flying, one of many hobbies, after the 1963 season, got his pilot license early in 1964, and then was flying a friend of his from California to Utah and back. They hit a sudden storm, and the plane crashed, and Ken Hubbs was dead. And that was the end of his story.
Yeah, absolutely tragic. Obviously, this was before Lytle. Obviously, this was before Munson. Yeah, look, really, really sad story. And you think of those Cubs teams of the 60s, with Santo, Ernie Banks, Billy Williams, et cetera, they could have used a guy like Hubbs. Glenn Beckert was a good second baseman, don't get me wrong, but Hubbs was shaping up to be something pretty darn good himself. I mean, do you think that the Cubs could have made a World Series sooner if Hubbs had stayed alive?
It certainly wouldn't have hurt their cause. As you mentioned, they not only had the three Hall of Famers in Banks, Williams, and Santo, but they also had Lou Brock, and a lot of people have said if they'd kept Brock, that could have changed their direction. They were really not a good team in the early 60s, despite all those stars. They just didn't have the pitching.
College of coaches.
Yeah, they didn't have the leadership or the pitching to really compete with the Dodgers and Giants and the stronger teams of the league at that time. Certainly Hubbs would have helped change that pattern.
No question about that. Talking to Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en route to Cooperstown. So we're almost halfway through this. I'm really having a great time talking to you about these forgotten players. I hope that the feeling is mutual. Is it?
I enjoy it, and I just want to point out that not all of the players in the book are forgotten. There's some better-known names like Denny McLean and Jose Fernandez and Rick Ankiel, Tony
and Pryor and Webb. Yeah.
So, I enjoy talking about these guys because not too many baseball fans know about them.
Right. That's why I chose to focus on these guys. I feel like everyone knows the story of Mark Pryor. Everyone knows the story of Brandon Webb. Everyone knows the story of Rick Ankiel. I wanted to focus on the lesser-known guys, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So what can you tell us about Bill Hutchison?
Bill Hutchison was arguably the best pitcher in baseball from 1890 to 92. He had a late start in his career. He was a businessman who pitched semi-pro baseball on the side, and when he had some business setbacks, he decided to pursue a pro baseball career and didn't make it to the majors until he was full-time until he was 29 years old, but then he proceeded to have 3 amazing years from 1890 to 92 where he, pitching for the Cubs, he won more than half of their victories in those 3 years, and we're talking about 36 to 40 plus wins per year, leading the league each season. In 1893, baseball's rules makers decided to change things up to make things better for the hitters. They moved the pitcher's mound back 5 feet, not 10 feet 6 inches as many people say. But they moved to the current distance of 60 feet 6 inches. Obviously, that made it tough for all pitchers, or tougher, but most were able to adapt. And certainly they gave up more runs, but they were still able to compete. But for whatever reason, Bill Hutchison was affected more than anybody else by this change, and he was just pretty well ineffective after 1892.
Yeah, you're 100% right that rule messed him up. I don't know why it affected him more than his counterparts, but yeah, look, if the mound had stayed at 55 feet, yeah, we'd be talking about him as a Hall of Famer. I don't think there's a question about that. Like I said, that's fate intervening.
Mm-hmm.
So can you lay out the career of my grandfather's favorite player, Charlie King Kong Keller?
I'm not a big fan of WAR, but that's
neither am I.
Very popular stat among historians, and it certainly has some validity. So, but I think that helps put Keller's career in perspective. If you count all players who played primarily left field, as Keller did since 1900, and who played at least 1,000 games, the number one player in WAR, not surprisingly, is Barry Bonds, and number 2 is Ted Williams, also not surprisingly. Number 3, since 1900 among left fielders, is Charlie Keller in WAR per game. And that's pretty heady company. Unfortunately, Keller was not able to have as long a career as those two, not nearly as long. He was a great slugger. He was great at drawing walks. He had speed, which is surprising given his stocky build. He would get 10 to 15 triples every year. He would run races against the fastest players on the Yankees and beat them all. He was a good fielder. He's a good team player, and he put up some excellent numbers from 1939 to 43 or so, 42. Then he was called into military service and missed a couple of years there. Came back and resumed his fine career, and he was overshadowed by Joe DiMaggio. But I think certainly in the last few years they were teammates. He was probably every bit as good as DiMaggio. But he had what turned out to be a congenital back problem, and in 1947, all of a sudden he just wasn't able to compete and had to have surgery, which was expected to end his career. He was able to return to the majors, but one leg was 2 inches shorter than the other as a result of the surgery. He would pull muscles more easily because of the surgery that he had on his back, and he had lost his power, and he just wasn't able to play at that level anymore. But he wound up having great success in a totally different field, and which was horse racing, raising prize horses, and had a long life and a wonderful family. So he's one of those who kind of had a happy ending to his story, even though it wasn't as a Hall of Fame baseball player.
Yeah, I mean, look, if Keller had stayed healthy, he would have been a member of, 7 World Series winning Yankees teams. I mean, that probably gets him in the Hall of Fame. Yeah, that back defect did irreparable harm to his career, but I'm glad that you brought up that he had success in another portion of his life. Just because you retire doesn't mean that, you're done. You're cooked, forget about it, you're not going to do anything. You can find success in another field, and that's what Keller did. I'm very glad that you brought that up, and I'm glad that he found some, for lack of a better word, redemption in another field.
Sure.
So how would you describe the career of Jim Maloney?
Jim Maloney was one of the fastest pitchers of his time. They didn't have radar guns back when he pitched in the 1960s. They did some measurements of speed among pitchers, and he emerged as the fastest pitcher of his time, faster than Sandy Koufax or Bob Gibson. But he was kind of overshadowed by those guys, along with Juan Marichal. But for a 7-year period, Maloney was right up there with the best pitchers in baseball. He was 23-7 one year with had 265 strikeouts in a season. He was really a feared pitcher, and he pitched 2 no-hitters plus another game where he pitched a no-hitter for 10 innings, but then gave up a couple hits in the 11th, I think it was, and wound up losing the game, and that was counted as a no-hitter at the time, but later stricken from the record books because it didn't wind up as a no-hitter. But he still ranks among the all-time leaders in fewest hits per 9 innings allowed throughout his career. He started having some arm problems and leg problems, and this was, as I mentioned with Busby, this was a time when, if a pitcher complained that his arm was bonky, the management would just tell him to suck it up and pitch through pain. And Maloney was kind of shamed into going out there even though his arm was hurting, and they, people didn't really take it seriously when a guy was still pitching effectively and still throwing no hitters. Well, how bad could his arm be hurting? And they found out in 1970 when it was actually a leg injury which sidelined him, but he in early 1970 at age 29, and he never won another game in the major leagues.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we took care of pitchers back then like we do now, Jim Maloney very well could have been a Hall of Famer. He was that talented. Really, really sad story. This isn't even learning to tell the difference between discomfort and pain. He was in pain, but no one took it seriously. I mean, it's a really, really sad story. It's a very cautionary tale.
Yeah, and Denny McLean talks about that too. I mean, he was complaining that his arm was hurting him during the 1968 season, and of course, he won 31 games that year, so nobody really took it too seriously, and they just kept giving him cortisone shots and different colored pills in the clubhouse. And he had another great year in '69, and then in '70 his arm fell off, and not literally, but that was
just about.
But and there's a lot of stories like that in that time frame where pitchers were overused in their early years and paid the price for it.
And McLean is a very nice guy, by the way. I don't know if you've ever met him, but he is a very nice man.
I have met him. I live in Cooperstown, and he, before COVID, would come to Cooperstown every year to do signings during Hall of Fame weekend. And I talked to him about my book and that he was going to be in it. And he shook my hand and had to lift his right arm with his left arm in order to shake my hand. That's how badly his arm was overused in his glory years.
Bill, next time I go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, I'll hit you up. I'll do lunch on Main Street.
Sounds good.
Talking to Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en route to Cooperstown. So what can you tell us about Carlos May?
Carlos is the younger brother of Lee May, who, as you know, was an excellent power hitter, especially in the 1970s for the Reds and Astros and several other teams. Hit 354 home runs in his career. But Carlos, his younger brother, looked like he was going to be even better than Lee. Even though he was 5 years younger, they both became All-Stars for the first time in the same year, 1969. That was Carlos's rookie year. He had 18 home runs at midseason, which doesn't sound like a whole lot today, but this was a time when the Chicago White Sox team home run record was 29. So he was certainly on pace to challenge that as a rookie. He hit for average. He had good speed. He hit to the gaps. He was hit for average. Really looked like he had the stuff. He was in Marine Reserves in August of that year doing some exercises at Camp Pendleton and he was swabbing a mortar which he did not realize was loaded, and the swabbing stick triggered the firing mechanism and shot the tool out and ripped off Carlos's thumb and did some other damage to his other hand and to his face. But it was the loss of the thumb that was the most critical. It was not expected that he would be able to return to major leagues, but he not only returned in 1970, he led the team in games played with 150. He was a decent player for several more years, but he no longer had the power. He had some trouble with fielding with the missing thumb. He was still hitting for decent average, but the positions that he played in the outfield and first base and later as DH are usually you want guys that can hit 20 or 30 home runs, and he was hitting more like 8 or 9 at that point. And so he eventually lost his major league job. He wound up playing in Japan for 4 more years and did well there, but it's really a shame that he was not able to enjoy the fruits of his talents for a long big league career.
There was a movie that came out in the mid-'80s, pretty obscure movie. It's called The Pope of Greenwich Village. Actually, pretty good movie. There's a scene in it where one of the characters gets his thumb cut off, and that's what I just keep going back to when you talk about Carlos May. Yeah, really, really sad story. But it did remind me of a forgotten 1980s movie. And Carlos May, just for whatever it's worth, former Yankee, so I keyed in on that. So can you lay out the career of Austin McHenry?
Austin McHenry was an up-and-coming player in the 1920s for the Cardinals. Another guy who was overshadowed during his career. He was teammate of Rogers Hornsby, who was the greatest hitter in baseball in the 1920s. And many observers thought that McHenry was ranked number 2 as the best all-around outfielder or player in the National League, maybe more for future value than what he had accomplished. But he had a great year in 1922, batted .350 with power, and just another good guy that was well liked throughout the league. The following year, he started out well, but then started having some headaches and some vision problems, and weren't sure what was going on, and he was sidelined for most of the second half of the season, and finally discovered that he had a brain tumor, and he died in November of that year. At a time when he should have been starting to reach his peak as a baseball player. His career and his life were snuffed out.
Yeah, McHenry was a great hitter, had some speed, had some pop. One of the biggest what-ifs in baseball history. There's no question about that. And, again, it's a shame that he's been lost to history. I'm with you that he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. So, how would you describe the career of Dave Orr?
Dave Orr was one of the best sluggers of the 19th century. At that time, most fields were not enclosed, so you couldn't get a home run by hitting the ball over the fence in a lot of places. There were only 4 long-term players from that era who had a slugging percentage over 500, and Orr was one of those. He had some dominant offensive seasons in the 1880s and into the early 90s. Hit 31 triples one year. That was more an indication of power than speed, because, as I said, with the non-enclosed ballparks, you just hit the ball over the outfielders or in the gaps, and you run as far as you can. It was .342 lifetime batting average. At age 31, shortly after one of his greatest seasons, he suffered a stroke and was never able to play baseball again.
Yeah, the thing that really stands out to me about Orr is all the RBIs he got. I mean, when he was getting going in 1884, this guy had a bunch of RBIs. He never had a season after 1884 where he had less than 59 RBIs. Never had a season where he hit under 300. 100% he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. And he has some bold type, too, which I like.
Mm-hmm. And this was in much shorter seasons, too, so don't be fooled. 59 RBI in fewer than 100 games is
it's incredible.
Yeah.
Players are going to play like 140, 150 games this year. They're not going to get anywhere near 59 RBIs, I promise you.
Mm-hmm.
Talking to Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en route to Cooperstown. So why did Pete Reiser run into so many walls?
This was a time when outfield walls were typically made of concrete. There were no warning tracks, no padded walls, nothing like that. And in fact, all those things eventually came about because of Pete Reiser. He was a guy who would stop for no player or no wall in pursuit of batted balls or extra bases. He was just a hell-bent for leather type of player. And he had many encounters with outfield walls, some of them really bad that caused concussions, almost put his life in danger. He would be bleeding and knocked unconscious in a couple of instances. And most of the time he would try to be right back in the lineup a few days later. And he was, in 1941, his first full season, he was the best player in baseball. Even though he was missing games due to injuries like that, he led the league in just about everything: runs, hits, doubles, triples, total bases, batting average, slugging percentage. And each year he would have more incidents like that, and he would miss more games and start to lose some of his effectiveness. And if you just look at his numbers, it's easy to see how his career trajectory just went on a downhill spiral, even though he was still an effective player for the most part until, say, 46, 47. And he missed, like many others, missed 3 years in military service too, so that didn't help his career numbers. But he was just really a sad story, and I mentioned in the book a story in the early 50s. They experimented with putting him as a catcher, thinking maybe that way he could stay healthy and contribute to the team. And then umpire Dusty Bogus, one of the long-term umpires of that era, looked on and commented, "I wonder how long he could have played if he was a catcher all his career instead of slamming into the walls." But then again, knowing him, he probably would have been diving into dugouts trying to catch foul balls. And Reeser himself, when asked about it later on, said, "That's if I tried to let up a step, if I tried to change my style, I might have lost the edge that made me a big leaguer in the first place." He can. That was the only way he knew how to play.
Yeah, the modern-day comparison to Pete Reeser is a guy like Aaron Rowan, really good outfielder, just kept running into walls, just couldn't help himself, would go all out on every play. Look, Reeser was a 3-time All-Star, finished in the top 10 of MVP voting all 3 of those years. Yes, he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. There's no question about that. In fact, I'll even go as far as to say that if Reeser had stayed healthy, the Brooklyn Dodgers would have beaten the New York Yankees in more than one World Series. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
I do agree with that.
So, what can you tell us about Louis Sockalexis?
Louis Sockalexis was the first full-blooded Native American to make it to the major leagues. He was a star in amateur leagues in Maine, and then went to Holy Cross College, and this is in the 1890s, and he batted well over 400 both years there. And finally, somebody noticed enough to bring him to the major leagues in 1897. He was what today we would call a 5-tool player. He had blazing speed, he had power, he hit for high average, and he was an excellent fielder, could throw the ball as far as anyone. And so he had a lot of hype accompanying his debut into the majors, and in fact, he was playing for the Cleveland National League team, which was known as the Spiders at that time. And before he even played a major league game, when he joined the team in spring training, they changed the name to the Indians in his honor. So it's kind of hard to imagine renaming a team after somebody who hasn't even played in the major leagues yet. But that's how much hype accompanied his entrance to the majors, and he was living up to the hype. For the first month or so in the majors, he was among the league leaders in everything. He was batting .385. He had stolen 13 bases in 24 games, and was among the top 5 in just about every offensive category. And then he just started he stopped hitting for power, and then he was having trouble fielding, and as it turns out, he was having trouble with the bottle, and he had been introduced to liquor. There's many fanciful stories as to when and where it happened, but in any case, he was no longer an effective player. He was injured in some drunken escapade, broke a leg jumping or falling out of a second-story window, was suspended by the team, and he wound up hitting .338 that rookie year, but he was never able to play regularly in the majors after that, and his was often referred to when people talked about the great what-ifs of the early part of baseball history. His was usually the first name people would think of, and when the American League came about in the 20th century, and their team in Cleveland was looking for a new nickname, they chose Indians again in his honor, even though by then he was deceased. So that gives some idea about how highly regarded his skills were, and how sad of a story it was that it stayed on people's minds long after he was gone.
And now they're changing the name. Think about that. They changed the name to honor a Native American who at the time were called Indians. Some people still call them Indians. And now they're changing the name. This was done to honor a Native American, to honor an Indian. Now they're changing a name because it offends Native Americans. I don't get it, Bill. I just don't. What are your thoughts on it? I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, we've seen that with the pro football, with the Redskins, and I've seen it right here in Cooperstown. The Cooperstown high school sports teams were called the Redskins for decades, and a few years back they had to change their name or decided that they had to change their name, and so it's
is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's changing ideas among people, I guess. I don't have strong opinions about it one way or the other, but
okay, that's fine. Look, if you're not the aggrieved party, I understand not having a strong feeling about it. I don't get changing the Cleveland Indians. That I don't think makes a lot of sense. Washington Redskins, I understand. Cleveland Indians, I'm not too crazy about.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you lay out the career of Carl Spooner? Carl
Spooner joined the Dodgers late in the 1954 season. And this was at a time where, as you mentioned before, the Dodgers would play well but then lose at the end every year. They lost the World Series in 1947, 1949, 1952, 1953. They missed out on reaching the World Series on the last day of the season in 1946, 1950, 51. So they were a team that was really good but couldn't quite get to the promised land. And when Spooner came up in that period, he looked like he was going to be the one that put them over the top. In his very first game, he pitched a shutout against the Giants, who were on the way to the World Championship, and struck out 15 batters, which at the time was a momentous achievement. Nobody else had struck out more than 13 in a game that whole season in the National League. And then in his next outing, on the last day of the season, Spooner pitched another shutout against the Pirates and struck out 12. So, and this was not a fluke. He had an amazing season in the minor leagues. He could really bring the ball. He had won over 20 games for a 500 team. He had struck out 262 batters, which was the most since Dizzy Deane in the season in that league. This is at the highest level of the minors. And so the Dodgers and their fans spent the whole winter just daydreaming about what Spooner could do in 1955 to bring them to the World Championship. You know, there was talk about him winning 25 or 30 games, and et cetera. Well, the Dodgers did wind up winning the World Championship in 1955, but Spooner had very little to do with it, unfortunately. He hurt his arm early in the year and during spring training, and it's another one of those. There's many versions as to how it happened, but the net effect was that he wasn't able to pitch without pain. He still showed occasional glimpses of his talent, but then he would go through some wretched spells, and he wound up 8-6 that year, and never pitched in the major leagues again, and only a few games in the minors even before his arm was just so shot that he wasn't able to play anymore.
Yeah, for old school Brooklyn Dodgers fans, Reeser and Spooner, the two biggest what-ifs in baseball history. I'm sure you'd agree with that, right?
Well, they're the only two that made my book. And Spooner, you know, most of the players in my book had at least one full great season. Spooner is the one exception that I put him.
No, he would have been really good.
Really, just based on 2 games in 1954, more than anything else that.
Yeah, definitely. Talking to Bill Deane, the author of Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. So how would you describe the career of Monty Stratton, for those of us who haven't seen his movie?
Yeah, the Stratton Stories was a well-known movie starring Jimmy Stewart in the 1940s, and was about Monty. And Stratton was a pitcher for the White Sox in the 1930s on a team that included Ted Lyons, who was a Hall of Fame member. Stratton was considered the ace of the staff. He had 2 very good years for some mediocre White Sox teams. If you look at his numbers for those 2 seasons compared to other American League pitchers, he's right up there, right behind Hall of Famers like Lefty Grove, Lefty Gomez, and Red Ruffing. And then following the 38th season, he was hunting in his yard and reached for his gun and accidentally discharged it into his leg. Wound up losing the leg and was not able to pitch in the major leagues again, although he did wind up making a very inspiring comeback in the minor leagues and won 18 games one year pitching on one leg in the minors in 1946, I think it was. And so that's what inspired the movie.
Yeah, look, it's a really, really sad story. There's no question about it. Yeah, 100% he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory, and the movie is really, really good. So what can you tell us about Hal Trosky?
Hal Trosky was putting up some great numbers as a slugger in the 1930s, and still another player who was overshadowed. He played first base at the same time that Lou Gehrig and Jimmy Fox and Hank Greenberg were playing first base. So 3 out of the 8 American League teams had top 10 sluggers of all time playing at first base. So Trosky was kind of lost in the shuffle. He was playing for Cleveland, which never really contended for the pennant in most years, and so he never got an all-star pick, but he had a monster rookie year in 1934, 374 total bases, and then 2 years later he had an even greater year where he drove in 162 runs and had over 400 total bases, and he was putting up some amazing numbers. If you look at his numbers at the same age as other players, everyone who's a comparison for him wound up in the Hall of Fame. In the late 30s, he started missing chunks of games, and it was never really explained why. And then finally, after a couple of years of that, he he explained that he'd been having what we now call migraine headaches, and they were so debilitating that he was unable to play a lot of the time, and even when he did play, he said, looking at the ball coming in, it looked like a bunch of feathers. And so he gradually lost his effectiveness as a hitter. And there are stories of pitchers would learn that if they held the ball an extra couple seconds, he would be unable to focus his eyes much longer, and then they would whip it in there. So he wound up with an lifetime average of 302 and a slugging percentage of 522, but he didn't have the career numbers that would make him a Hall of Fame candidate.
Yeah, look, in an era with guys like Jimmy Fox, Hank Greenberg, and Lou Gehrig, Hal Trotsky was right up there with those guys. He was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. There's no question about that. I also like that he was mentioned in the Dave Frischberg song, Van Linkelmungo, a very good song. Bill, do you like that song?
I do like that. I think it's celebrating its 40th anniversary.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, that I didn't know. All right, Bill, I'll get you out on this. Can you lay out the career of Smokey Joe Wood?
Smokey Joe Wood is one of those redemption stories. He came up in the early part of the 20th century as a teenager and was the fastest pitcher, was regarded as the fastest pitcher in baseball, even faster than Walter Johnson, and Johnson himself even said that. He won 23 games in 1911 at age 22 and pitched a no-hitter. And then in 1912, he just had an off-the-charts season. He was 34-5, 34 wins, 5 losses, 3 more wins in the World Series. He struck out 258 batters, and he was, just a great pitcher, and he was only 23 years old. Another one of those stories, after pitching all those innings at a young age, he developed arm problems, and he was still an effective pitcher for the next few years, but he would be sidelined for long stretches of time between outings. One year he wound up leading the league in earned run average and win percentage, but he pitched fewer than 200 innings, which in those days was not a lot for a starting pitcher, and nowadays he probably would lead the league. But he eventually got to the point where he couldn't pitch anymore, and he asked his old friend Tris Speaker, his old Red Sox teammate, who is now the Indians manager, if he could get a job on the Indians, and so Tris arranged for that, and Joe Wood tried to pitch, but he wasn't able to. And then a lot of the players were called into military service for World War I. And Wood said, "Well, I'm not just a pitcher. I'm an athlete." He was already known as a good hitter and as a good fielder. He wound up coming back as a full-time outfielder and played 5 years as an outfielder and batted .298 over that span. He wasn't a superstar as an outfielder, but he was a good, solid player, helped the Indians to a World Series championship. And then after retiring from that, he became a long-time college baseball coach for Yale. And so he wound up living to age 95 or so and becoming kind of an elder statesman for baseball quotes and mentions in books, and he got an honorary degree from Yale. It was presented by Bart Giamatti shortly before Joe's death, and so he was featured in the book The Glory of Their Times, and that kind of brought him back into the consciousness of baseball fans. This was an era where once you're done with baseball, for most people, that was pretty much the end of it. You didn't hear much about them anymore. There was not much TV or that sort of thing to keep names in the spotlight. The Hall of Fame was kind of a fledgling thing where they would have small crowds that came for the induction ceremonies, and that was about the highlight of the year for them. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting to think about a Red Sox rotation that could have had Babe Ruth, Smokey Joe Wood, Rube Foster, and Ernie Shore, for an extended period of time. Carl Mays, too. That team may never have been broken up. Ruth may not have gone to the Yankees. It opens up a big Pandora's box. It opens up a lot of what ifs, Bill. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Yeah, the Red Sox had a great team in the 1910s and won several World Series, even with losing the services of Joe Wood and then wound up trading pretty much all their great pitchers to the Yankees, as you mentioned about Ruth. And,
thank you, Ed Barrow.
Yeah, so and the story is that the Red Sox owners was trying to finance his other career, which was in Broadway or on Broadway, and so that's why he was selling.
No.
That's the story.
All right, Bill. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks.
All right, that was Bill Deane. His book is Baseball's Who's Who of What Ifs, Players Derailed en Route to Cooperstown. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. I'm going to put a bow on the Brooklyn Nets season Monday night. Regular episode of the Jacob Valk Show comes your way every weekday afternoon. Now that the Stanley Cup Playoffs are upon us, I'm going to focus heavily on that. Until next time, I am Jacob Valk saying that my grandmother's cemetery has more life in it than Three Rivers Stadium.